the oil and gas industry or a commercial space. Procedures should describe what should happen, but the culture determines what actually happens. Can it actually be done and executed in this way? And under pressure, behaviors tend to override the process that you had. So it really comes down to that factor. The risk culture is revealed at that particular decision point. So I like to see it as a bit of an iceberg, and that culture lives beneath that visible risk system. So the top of the iceberg are all the policies, the risk registers, the framework, the audits, and all of that stuff that you may be wanting to do to say everything's compliant and in place. But below the surface are the incentives people have, the incentives to do either good or negative, the fear, the power, the time pressure that accompanies that. And that culture lives beneath the risk system. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Dilbert and different comics as well. And I'm sure on the screen that you can see that sometimes as organizations, as leaders, we say one thing and we do another, or we expect another. We can say, hey, you know what, today we want to improve our corporate culture. Let's get people around the table. Let's find out what's been going wrong. But actually, do we really walk that talk? Because when we start to surface where things are going wrong, honesty doesn't seem to be the currency we want to operate in. And that type of culture is what eventually leads to major risk events. Or do we have a blame culture? It's always looking for, who did what wrong where? That's not a learning culture, one that can seek to build on that risk intelligence that frameworks like ISO 31000 is helping you to surface. But it all really starts with accountability. And I'm not here to create cultural change agents, because that actually is a very a nice long course that we could do and look at what we could change internally. But to highlight that culture is and can actually eat your strategy for breakfast. So accountability, even within ISO 31000, is where the leadership behavior can meet the framework. So again, this is what ISO 31000 looks like. A reminder, one of the elements of it or the principles of it is requiring leadership and commitment, and it recognizes that human behavior and culture impacts the risk management. But accountability is the ownership of those outcomes and not blaming others or processes or systems for failure, but recognizing where it can go wrong. The risk acceptance, which is something that is a terminology very nicely embedded into the risk appetite as well within ISO 31000, should always be explicit and clear to others. It shouldn't be assumed that our appetite for risk is this, but it's actually not. Today we're okay with having a broken window in our house, but the roof is off. So it should also be quite sensible using that example. Clear decision authority in any risk management process will strengthen the risk ownership. Who owns the risk? Who has the ability and the authority to influence those risks and to influence others? It's quite key in that empowerment of it. And in strong risk cultures, risk acceptance is a conscious act. In weak ones, it happens by silence. So on the right-hand side of the screen here are two things that we often don't talk enough about. In the enterprise risk culture framework, which should be embedded in ISO 31000, and it is not well enough, is individuals have a personal predisposition to risk. And that's based on their personal ethics, their values, which tends to form what their behaviors were, and collectively with a span of different employees or people that work, forms an organizational culture, which determines what your risk culture looks like. But your risk culture actually involves everyone, every single person, from the person that is there to make your offices look good and to the person that is there to make the high-level CEO decision or to press the famous red button in the control room. All of these things are based on what I'd like to call the results pyramid. And the results pyramid is something that came from the Oz principle. We're not going to go too much into details, but often when we talk about culture, we're talking about an action and a result, an action and a result. But if in an organization, you only look at the model or the framework that tells you this is what I should be, this is the control strategy I should have, and this is how I should manage it, and that's the result, and this is how it should look like, and I audit it and I check that works, you may be getting the same outcome every time, and that's not the desired outcome. Because the real thing to change the actions to have a permanently good result is to start looking below that pyramid. That is the experiences of the people that are actually executing the work. Because the experiences we have, whether it's in an organization where you can't speak up, forms the belief you will hold, and it will affect the type of actions you take and the end result. Collectively, that forms the culture. So if you really want to change the culture, you've got to start changing the experiences individuals and a company has in order for there to be new beliefs and to have a different set of results that are more viable and sustainable for the industry, for your industry. So leadership behavior, in my view, is a cultural multiplier. Leaders actually shape the risk culture through everyday response. How they react to bad news signals exactly what is truly valued. If you watch your leaders saying, "Oh well, today we've lost 80% of production," they're first looking at whose head needs to roll. Then that creates a culture that where people won't speak up as to why we had lost our production, why was there this equipment failure, why was this business process that was weak, or why have we lost so many people or had high attrition, etc. So what leaders tolerate becomes the real standard, and it can override the best framework in the world. That culture is reinforced in moments of pressure, and they are not determined by policy. So what are we talking about this? When we're talking about the steps to real accountability and taking ownership of things, I want to first start with what's below the line. And that's what the type of negative or ineffective or substandard cultures will do. They'll always be about, ignoring or denying the real problems that may exist. Or you see it as it's kind of not my job, or let's wait and see what will happen with the market. Or of course, there are some cases where you have to do that, but where you're waiting and to see when it's about to go wrong, covering your tail, finger pointing, the blame game that plays, or looking for full guidance on others to tell you what to do, which is the purest form of micromanagement. But the steps to accountability is where we are able to see it. That is to firstly obtain difficult perspectives from others, and then take ownership of that, start beginning to solve it and doing that. So being very much invested in that as risk leaders and creating that culture that starts shifting those experiences will start driving better performance in the risk culture space. But what do the early warning signs of a risk culture drift looks like? Because every now and again you may think you have the best culture in the world, and then bam, an incident happens. And when you start going back into understanding what happened, you start seeing the small signs of drift. A negative risk culture is something much like this picture on the right-hand side of the screen. It's like you're driving a car, and just when you're about to take that sharp hairpin bend, you see the sign that warns you about the sharp hairpin bend. It's a little too late. But the sign was actually always there. So how we design processes determines how effective the strategy could look like. So decisions made before risks are openly discussed is an early warning sign that your risk culture is actually the threat in the real landscape. That is, you're already making discussion before you actually discuss the risk with the right level of stakeholders. There are repeated deviations or overrides that start becoming, really normalized within the business. So, we call it normalization of deviance in more technical industries, is where you get used to seeing things just the way they are and you accept it for what it is. And you kind of go on about your day-to-day business until something inevitably goes wrong. Like a crack in a pipe, and that it's a pinhole in the pipe, but everybody sees that drip, drip, drip. And after a few weeks, you stop seeing that it's dripping because you walk by it and your mind is normalized it until the pipe ruptures. Similar in other processes that may not have pipes, but may have processes that have holes that we're walking past every day. There's an unclear ownership at interfaces and handovers. So in your business processes, it's not clear who owns what, so that they can have the ability to take effective decisions and how they hand that over, whether it's your succession planning, whether that is the next phase of a project. That also is a sign that we're not doing something well from a risk management, risk culture perspective. When we're only talking about risk very periodically and not operationally, usually it's a bit of a red flag for me. But what does good risk management look like? And I wish this could be a bit more interactive, where we could spar about what we think it looks like or what it should look like. If you really look at this, is sometimes we think, of course, part of ISO 31000, the compliance piece, it says we should have a lot of nice things that will turn risk into a strategic advantage. Some of those practical tools for ISO 31000 and any of your risk management strategies, having the right risk registers, knowing what the risks are, how big the risk is, and what is the controls and who's responsible. Good. So that's your risk registers and your heat map that tells you how much you're willing to tolerate. Sometimes you have bow ties, which again, that determines what your control strategies are. It has a number of safeguards and controls in there that you analyze these barriers on a regular basis. And of course, you have other techniques when things go wrong, like incident investigations using a whole number of different techniques, dashboards and KPIs like, yeah. So, this should be a strategic advantage that you're doing really things well and planning out scenarios of where things can go on, virtual planning, gamification, all of these things help us to see where the threats may lie. These are really good things. And of course, we start talking about ESG and operational risk. These are really good. Risk tools inform decisions, right? But they don't make them. The risk ratings alone in here, in the section here, cannot capture the context or the genuine consequence. You think you can? Most failures will actually occur within what you defined as the acceptable risk threshold. It's controversial that I've said that, but many incidents reveal that. So there are conscious trade-offs that are being made no matter how much perfect scoring is made in these kind of very quantitative but necessary assessments. The decision pathway is more important than some of these tools. We've got to do it. It's actually giving us flags into where the threats are, but that is not a guarantee that isn't. How do you genuinely turn your risk into a strategic advantage? It's actually your risk culture. That's when leadership sets the right tone and they determine what the risk appetite is. What can you genuinely tolerate? That's when you start translating ISO 31000 into industry muscle memory. And you show that culture is the operating system that allows that framework and some of those tools we've just seen earlier do what they're supposed to do. This is when you start seeing compliance in context. That's when risk gets embedded into planning and operation. There's cross-functional collaboration across a diverse set of stakeholders and a diverse set of departments, because risk translates through an organization very differently, because organizations are generally very complex. Not all the risks are in the boardroom, right? Some are on the ground, some is actually at the bank teller, some is actually in the space of geopolitics, how things are being moved and so on. So we've got to have cross-functional collaboration and remove those silos. Got to have continuous learning when there's incidents and near misses, and feed that back into the risk strategy to see if you've got to pressure test what you're saying is good enough to say, okay, can this fail? Is this how this goes wrong? We've got to focus on both threats and the opportunities, because when we talk about risk is not always negative, right? So risk culture, essentially, there's strong and weak risk culture. These are not an exhaustive list. You can be able to talk about issues openly. You can balance risk taking, because we have to have an appetite for risk in order to be in any form of business. There has to be accountability of who does what, where, and who can take ownership and how we can take ownership. And there needs to be risk in daily decisions and daily discussions. Weak risk culture creates an environment where there's just an emotional threshold where you cannot even speak up. It's a fear-based environment. You avoid risks. There's a lack of ownership. It's tick box compliance. It's just waiting for that next incident to take place. But good risk culture is always based on accountability, transparency, and learning. These are 3 principles that are embedded within ISO 31000's framework. So yeah, let's talk about what it can be a little practically. Now, I'm not sure where we are in terms of time, so I'm hoping that we're doing okay in that. But risk culture in action, when we think about ISO 31000 across different industries, because we come from so many different backgrounds, ISO 31000's reality is that risk frameworks will only work when the culture allows the risk to influence the decision, right? But how does that look in different industries? So I've worked in the mining industry for a few years, the last 4 years of my career. And when we're talking about the type of culture, that just one example is that people are not afraid, should not be afraid to stop the work. And that should be supported irrespective of whether there's pressure, because not stopping the work is often because there's a threat. The mine could collapse. There's a strike. These are major issues that can weaken the organization's reputation, its performance, its assets, and so on. So when you have the culture that is empowered to do that, that starts to look like reality. What does that link to in ISO? That's the leadership and commitment piece and the human and cultural factors part. So yeah, that's one example. Like in the energy industry, when you can challenge the schedule, when safety barriers, for example, are not ready, as we're going through designing some of these processes, and you say, look, it's not ready for commissioning, when we set the space where we can already say, we've got to hold up here until we're satisfied that the design barriers are adequate, because if it is not, it can lead to an incident that is undesired for us. Then you set a good risk culture. that comes down from the space of being, from the place of being dynamic and responsive and integrated, and that is again an ISO 31000 principle. So the emphasis here for me is that these are all moments of pressure, and that's something that the ISO 31000 framework needs to allow. And there will be different outcomes because the culture always determines behavior. So ISO 31000 will make it clear that risk management can only work when leadership, culture, and decision-making are aligned. So some of these industry examples and what it looks like in practice can differ. So hopefully, when we have a little bit of a Q&A, we can talk about some of the examples you have in your industry. I have a few more here, like in banking, when profitable deals stop when the risk appetite is breached, because there is a defined risk appetite that you have within your risk principles, right, at the start of your process. But if you can stop a good deal because it's actually outside of appetite, then that speaks to using your risk framework to make solid decisions. It's, again, a good example of leadership in the research industry. When you have a failed experiment and you start analyzing them to understand why, then you start to surface what the hidden threats were across the entire process. And that goes to the explicit uncertainty and best available information that speaks to an ISO 31000 principle. Pharmaceutical industry, if you can pause some of your trials when you start seeing early safety warnings out, whether it's I think time back we were speaking of COVID vaccines and some of the early safety signals that might have been emerged during the trials and testing of that might have prevented them from choosing a certain vaccine. So they would have had to put that through a risk appetite, a risk management process, and that is the protection of value and integration principle. So why is the risk culture a game changer at the end of the day? Simple, because what ISO 31000 requires in practice is that we have leaders who can reward escalation. So that is looking at the positive side of things. That is the above the line behavior. We start being able to see if our risk appetite can hold under pressure conditions, which will always happen when you have an operating business. It starts to generate early, honest thinking around the risk information you have. When you have risk that is embedded in your real decisions, what does the culture decide at the end? It's whether bad news is surfaced or suppressed. And bad news can be the make or break of any business. Whether incentives actually distort the risk appetite. So incentives can be good or bad. Whether ISO enables values or just compliance theater, I like to call it, where it's just really a show. And we're just looking at the tick box of saying, these are the 10 things I need to achieve in my framework and tick, tick, tick. But actually underneath the surface is all the threats. So your culture decides that. So challenge for the audience is, where in your organizations, where did your organization last ignore a risk signal, or whether it was a weak signal or a strong signal, and what did it actually cost the business at the end of the day? Because again, ISO 31000 doesn't fail because of weak frameworks. It fails when culture prevents the risk from influencing the decisions, as we've said. So yeah, if you have no risk culture, then your ISO will become that compliance theater. All right. So your risk culture, if you think about it, is like the operating system that allows that framework to work across any industry. So transparency, now, that's something that we're just going to very touch on because it's kind of obvious, right? It's where risk culture will see or fail. Creating a teams and corporate culture that fosters open dialogue versus closed dialogue has value, right? Transparency means that you can always surface uncertainty earlier. Trade-offs will be visible and not implied, so you know what your next strategy or your controls need to be, or whether your controls are good enough. It makes risk conversations a hell of a lot easy because those conversations actually precede the decision rather than following them. So, you take a decision and try to regress things back around it rather than saying, these are the risks, this is what we see going on with the right level of stakeholders around. And that engagement, and this is where you can take solid decisions. So it actually separates reporting from real transparency, which I think should resonate across all industries. Silence always hides risk until it becomes an event. Yeah, so in a lot of industries we have procedures, and how do we make them work in practice? I'm going to skim over this really quickly. Too much documentation or not enough knowledge. So sometimes we develop so many procedures and processes, not necessarily because it's just a compliance exercise, because it helps us cover our trail rather than being effective to getting the work done. It drives bureaucracy, and bureaucracy actually is another barrier to effective risk management. because it doesn't allow you to surface threats until the incidents have happened. So we've got to actually start making, embed risk discussions in decision pathways, get the right people involved in developing the procedures. I say that right at the end. Use some of the enterprise and operational risk language, but make sure that it's universal to the person who's executing the work on the ground, all the way to the board level. It shouldn't be terms that are so unfamiliar to everyone or so large that it's isolated the organization. Always clarify what you're willing to tolerate. That's the risk acceptance criteria, and how you can escalate risk without there being negative consequences to the person who's done. So procedures must be there to support judgment, not to replace it. So when we go from processes to practice, I like to think of this picture is that culture is the bridge between processes and decisions. And ISO 31000 should provide that structure for that consistency, as long as leadership can set the tone, because risk culture is actually set from the top, but engages everyone as well. So strong risk culture actually makes uncertainty discussable. Risk culture, as we've said a few times throughout this, is behavior under pressure. What you do when the conditions around you are tough, when the market is tough, when the controls are failing, when things have to happen on the fly. The people around you and how the organization is empowered to take those decisions, for good or bad, is determined by this. So risk culture is not built by controlling people. It's built by making ownership unavoidable. This is a slide I put together earlier, but I think it's actually not entirely necessary. It's something we typically use in operational environments. We talk about the risk culture model, or the journey to world class. You can do a little bit of research on it. It's called the journey model. It's kind of going from just doing what you're told to, and because you can do it as long as no one gets caught, whether that's operating a line, or whether that's operating an entire process, or it's reactive. You only start looking at where things can go wrong after they go wrong, or it's calculative. We think we have enough systems in place and we manage all the risks around us, but it's not actually a learning process that can surface things early. A great risk culture is one that becomes very generative. It's how we do business now. It's in the DNA of the individual. So that comes from the values the company will set, and makes them really resilient. So this is a really highly technical topic that we're going to just skip on and skim over. Something I want to just kind of challenge everyone here around the table is, you have your industry, you have your implementation. How do you identify that? And some questions is, what's the number one cultural behavior that undermines risk-aware decision-making in your organization? Is it the speed over the challenge? You kind of rush to do things in a challenging environment, so we've got to get it done quickly. Don't necessarily look at all the options available. Is it actually choosing silence over escalating where threats lie? Or is it comfort over ownership? It could be a number of things as well, and that could be very specific to the backgrounds you come from. Culture always shapes the framework. So does your risk framework reflect how decisions are actually made and how you wish they were made? Risk conversations, the inclusivity over it, and are the people closest to the risk actually influencing the decisions? In this day of AI, are we reliant on just the model, or a Grok, or a chat GPT, or whatever to help us make those decisions, or we just use them to test the assumptions? Or are we only informing some of the people after the fact? So getting more people around the table, or the right number of people, the right, whether it's different skill sets, whether it's, just a diverse group of people and backgrounds to look at your threat register. It will help you build what your risk conversations and whether your control strategy is effective. And how do you respond under pressure? When uncertainty becomes real, which it often does the culture that your company has, you have, even in your household, there's a home risk culture. Does it encourage ownership and transparency? Or is it just, we justify and deflect and blame someone? So lastly, just as a fun picture is, what do winning teams look like? So this is a picture of the South African rugby team. They're known for winning trophies, and their culture is more than just their skill set. It's their belief system, their value system, their ability to understand threats, weaknesses, opportunities within their team, and to play to those things. They will never be perfect, but they have a risk management strategy that is about continuously learning and continuously winning together amongst our diverse skills. So that's a little bit about, it's not telling you how to go out and create a risk culture, but that a risk culture should be one of the heart of the focus when you are setting up a risk management framework. So yeah, that's it from me, I think. Yeah, should I stop sharing and we have a bit of a chat?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Krishni, for that wonderful session along with the wonderful presentation. And now the question and answer platform has officially opened. So please feel free to ask Krishni whatever questions that you may have. Let's see if we're getting any questions.
Maybe while we're waiting for those, maybe while we're waiting for those questions, just in the chat, maybe, which industries are people coming from that have attended this particular session? Just a nice sense of where we're all from.
Of course. Meanwhile, I'm also going to take a look at if we have any questions in the live that we are holding.
Yeah. Well, I see a question from Mahesh Krishnan.
Oh, yes. How will you go for culture audit to identify issues?
This is a great question, Mahesh. And I think irrespective of which organization people come from, it's important to do something like a health check. And you can have this done independently by, specialized companies that look at company culture, organizational culture, or you can just start really simple. But and the simple way is to run anonymous surveys across the organization around, a few key points. Am I able to speak up here about risks that I see, whether it's a risk in a cafeteria, or whether it is a risk to policies, whether it's a risk to trades, bribes, and making that very anonymous, and a no name, no blame. It gives you a sense as a first screening as to what the culture looks like. If you get a lot of responses, and if you have 100 people and you get 80 responses, you probably have a culture that feels that they can speak freely into that, even if it's anonymous. But if you get very little responses, then it's also a red flag that this may not be a place that's psychologically safe enough to speak in. And another cultural audit is to take your ISO 31000 framework that you have, and across each and every element is to put it under a pressure test to say, is there an element here where I can tolerate the risk, treat the risk, or transfer it from a people perspective? And that's important because that starts looking at your risk maturity culture, and what is kind of the shared set of beliefs that people hold with that. So I would do that, or you can always appoint, a third-party company that makes it quite complex, but also keeps it very anonymous to understanding where the weaknesses are in an organization. And they help you build a very, best fit strategy to quickly bringing that turnaround. Because a lot of the, cultural impact that I see in organizations is also not willful. I think we have different generations also working in the workforce, and whether they're the boomers or the Gen X, or I'm a Gen X, by the way, and whether they're the millennials or what is the Gen Z that's in the workforce as well. They have different ways of working and different ways of communicating, and often those drifts between them can result in actually a hole in the risk management strategy. So I think that's also understanding the people and having a set of values that encompasses everyone.
That definitely makes sense when you say that, different generations working in one industry. So definitely it also changes the way. And yes, now we'll look forward for the second question that we have. What techniques do you think can be employed in a situation where the leadership tone about risk is one that needs changing?
This is a tough one because whether an organization is small or large, the conversation is difficult. And there is no, of course, there's health checks and little screening tools that you can use for your organization. That's part of a technique. But how do you get the leadership to change that tone? It starts with seeing where the threats actually lie. And you have a pool of data currently available to you. One is you see that there are a number of, whether it's process incidents within the organization, maybe from a business perspective, you're not hitting your targets, the morale of the team is low. There has to be a person and it requires a person to raise that, to say, is this what needs changing? It's also recognizing that in order to have a good management framework, has to be executed by people. And so it's people, processes, and hardware at the end of the day. And if the people element doesn't get the attention it needs, because we focus on the hardware, whether the barrier is working, whether the computer is the right one. But if we've not had any of those discussions, then that's the piece I would raise to say, well, hey, leadership, we spend time on hardware and the processes, but we've never looked at the people aspect of it. And people is not just about hiring and human capital; it's about effectiveness and whether we're seeing all that we can see in the possibility of not just risk, but risk is actually the profit center of the business, because if you manage that, you can be more profitable. So it's about conversations as well and being empowered enough to say that.
Thank you so much, Krishni, for that insightful answer. Let's look at the other questions. And I also hope it answered your question, Taqif. Yes, question. What is an approach when there is a culture who has lack of operational cultures around AI risk, in bracket Gen AI sprawl, and how to prioritize when there is a hold on funds?
Good question. And I think not just for the type of risk that you've listed, which is these AI risks, but in general, we're always competing we're always operating in a resource threatened world where there are competing needs of where you should spend money. Some of it may be in training the AI to do better work. Some of it may be in the people that need to do the training. And of course, these are not subjects that are that close to my heart from the technical perspective or my knowledge base. The first thing starts is with the risk assessment in this particular case. So part of all your risk assessments, whether it is for a process or a hazard study or what can go wrong in your enterprise of risk, should ask the question of culture, should ask the question of people's competency, people's capability, AI's capability, readiness, and putting a time factor against that. So once you start incorporating that into that risk assessment, it will start surface that is a threat and that may be within or outside of appetite. I would start including that in the early risk assessments.
Thank you so much, Krishni, for that answer once again. And yeah, we have a couple more questions coming, so I hope you're okay with it. How can one make the leader see the importance of using their risk appetite in making decisions?
Now, I wish we could just take our leaders and hold them by the shoulder and shake this into them, which should be common sense, but it's sometimes not as easy as that. So we hope in every organization that there's a risk person, somebody responsible for the management framework. I would start with that person, if it's still a person, that is, and to start raising, is this mapped to our risk appetite? Maybe the first question is, what have we defined what the risk appetite is? And do we know the difference between appetite, threshold, and acceptance criteria? Because often what I've seen, even in the largest companies, I've worked for one of the largest mining companies in the world, and this was not defined, 30,000 employees, because we're too afraid to put our hand on our heart and say, well, this is what we're willing to tolerate and accept, until you go to court, of course. So the first thing is to ask those leaders or the risk expert or the risk manager, has the risk appetite been defined? And is that linked and integrated to how we make decisions, whether it is in our new projects, brownfields or greenfields, or how we allocate capital, and in our day-to-day operations? Is it always mapped to that? Because that should be that basic integration. How do you make the leaders see that? I wish I had the nuance for it. I can say ask the question, and but there's obviously some finesse attached to that.
Thank you so much, Krishni. And yes, like as we move forward, Mahesh also asked, does culture doctor must in the era of AI?
100%. I think more than ever before, that particular resource needs to be in every single team. Because as we're moving away from more human-based models and focus, while AI was supposed to be there to assist us to be more effective, But right now we're seeing it, taking over some of the things that we used to do without freeing our capacity to do the more creative things. There needs to be a test to understand, or we need to test what the threats are associated with that. Some of those threats may be socioeconomic. Some of those threats may actually be to the very viability of the business. And until those questions are actually embedded in the risk assessment, because every time you introduce a new process, like, okay, we're now going to have AI agents, for example, we should go back to the core risk assessment of the business, which is in the enterprise framework or in the operational risk framework, and say, well, we never asked the question about AI, let's unpack the AI hazard, because from there we'll start seeing whether the control strategy is effective or whether we've introduced new risks. Because every time you introduce something more, there's a trade-off that now brings about an additional sets of risks that may need new controls or may disable old controls. So that's why it's important in not just embracing the technology without going through the governance that's associated with it. And you definitely need a culture doctor for that. Or someone
Thank
to
you
come
so
in
much.
and do that. Yeah.
That was, something I guess that we all had to hear. And yes, like we also have one more question over here. So I hope like you still have time, right?
Yes, yes, we do.
Yeah, okay. How do you convince the management to invest in risk management when they are focusing on profitability in the short term?
The two things are the same thing. So risk management is your profit center. Because let's just say we're in a business to manufacture houses. We want to construct houses in Europe, because Europe doesn't have as many new buildings emerging like like emerging economies. And if your business is to make houses, but you're building those houses in areas that have high floods, or all of these things, they're subject to a series of risks. Now, this example is not to be taken in that specificity, but when you see that the risk management and the profitability or the viability of the business go hand in hand, then that is where management needs to make decisions. So we need to know your risk appetite, your risk threshold, and then you put new ideas through that filter through a cost benefit analysis. So your cost benefit or your cost risk reduction analysis, which now talks to whether profit or value is linked to risk, comes into play. And that directly links to the appetite and the threshold. So how do we convince management? They first have to recognize that risk management and profit go hand in hand. And everything we do, especially when it's more requiring a complex capital involvement or complex change in the business, needs to look at cost benefit analysis along with the risk appetite.
Thank you so much, Krishni. And yes, if anyone have any more question, we would like to take more questions if you have. And meanwhile, I'm also sharing Krishni's LinkedIn over the chat box. So please make sure that you're, connecting with her on LinkedIn. And let's see if we are getting any more questions.
That would be an absolute pleasure. Please reach out to me via inbox. Happy to take more questions, where you have a bit more time for me to even apply a bit of thinking. I'm happy to share checklists, examples as well that might be useful for you to talk with your leaders. And if you are also a leader, maybe the type of conversations you need to have to integrate across and involve other stakeholders in your teams to be more effective. Because yes, leadership sets the tone, but leadership can't run with that on their own. They must set the tone, but they need to engage and involve their teams and the real work on the ground in order for it to be effective risk management. And that's what sets the culture. It's those two things coming together. So how we can do that, happy to share those details in another format.
Thank you so much, Krishni. And yes, like we are getting messages here. Thank you for such an informative and engaging presentation. Perfect topic to end the week. That's really nice.
Thank you so much, Dana. And it was really a pleasure to be here. Mahesh, I see you have a question about multi-risk appetite at ERM level. Yes, it does exist, and it depends on the hazard and the risk category. So some risks may only have one appetite, but other risks may have more, especially when we're talking about reputational risk and financial risk together. So there may be different appetites within the two, because reputation can be compliance, legal, and all these other things get attached to it. So there can be that depending on the organization. It's been a pleasure to participate in this, and happy to take questions offline. This is not my core topic, but certainly one I'm very passionate about in some of the work I do.
Thank you so much, Krishni. And yes, with this, we are coming to an end for today's session. And yes, thank you so much once again, Krishni. We would love to have you here sometime in future as well, so we can always gain more insights from you about your experience. And I have a couple of announcements to make. So I hope my screen is visible right now. So to everyone who would like to get themselves certified, you are getting a 20% discount, especially for all the attendees who are here today. So I'm sharing the more details in the chat box soon. And GSDC has also launched a utility tool which will help you take your career to the next level. And it's 100% free for all the attendees who join this session. So all you have to do is use the code AUG100 and get you started from there. And yes, like in the first week of March, we are celebrating women leading the AI powered enterprise. So make sure you are using the scanner and getting yourself registered, because this is going to be amazing panel of women in the industry who will be giving us insights on their overall experience in their field. And tomorrow, that is next week's first series, which is starting with Seema Goel. It will be 10:30 p.m. SGT and 8 p.m. IST. So make sure you're joining next week's series as well. And followed by the AI series, which we will be having from 16 to 20 in February. So if it's something that interests you, make sure you're part of it, along with the learning and development series that is aligned for the next week as well. And now it's time to celebrate our referral champions, Astik Saxena, Rakesh Ranjan, and Bandi Hemad. Thank you so much for spreading the awareness. And if you would like to be a part of this leadership, all you have to do is invite your colleagues and your coworkers, your communities to one of these events. And as soon as you start to climb up the leaderboard along with your referral codes, you earn vouchers for $400 from GSDC. And if you would like to be one of our guests on the CAP Learning Capsule podcast or this series, you can reach out to me on gauri@gsdccouncil.org, and I'd be happy to get you started from there. And lastly, we would love to connect with you. So make sure you're following us on LinkedIn. Visit our website for more details. You can also join the exclusive WhatsApp group that keeps you updated about all the sessions that are aligned. And if you could kindly share your session takeaways and learning outcomes on reviews.io, we would be delighted to read them. And with this, we're coming to an end for today's session. So make sure you're joining the next week's series as well. And thank you so much once again, everyone, including Krishni. And have a good day ahead and good night.